I folded the last dish towel and set it on the counter, and when my mother-in-law walked into the kitchen and said, "We need to talk about the house," I already knew it wasn't going to be a conversation. It was never a conversation with her. It was always a verdict. The house she meant was my grandmother-in-law's house in Lunenburg. A 3-story Victorian on a hill above the harbor. Painted the kind of deep blue that looks almost black in winter, with white trim and a wraparound porch that creaked in a specific spot near the 3rd step, the one my husband had told me about on our 2nd date. He described it the way people describe places they go to in their minds when everything else gets too loud. I had loved that house before I ever set foot in it. And I had loved her, his grandmother, Loretta. From the first afternoon she sat across from me at that kitchen table and told me, without ceremony, that she thought I had good instincts. Coming from Loretta, that was nearly a declaration. That was 7 years ago. A lot changes in 7 years. The conversation my mother-in-law wanted to have that evening was not, as it turned out, about grief. We had buried Loretta 4 months earlier, in October, in the rain, and the grief had mostly been mine and my husband's, and Loretta's neighbor Marta's, who brought blueberry loaves to the reception and cried into her sleeve by the window. My mother-in-law, I'll call her by what everyone called her, which was Vivienne, had not cried. She had organized. She had made phone calls. She had spoken to the estate lawyer, a quiet man from Halifax named Mr. Arsenault, and she had apparently been forming plans she had not yet shared with the rest of us. The sensible thing, Vivienne told me that evening, in the kitchen of the Lunenburg house where we had all gathered for what she called a family weekend, would be to list it in the spring. The market is strong. Properties like this in the South Shore don't sit long. I said I didn't know that any decision had been made. She looked at me the way she had been looking at me for 6 years, which was the way a person looks at a door that opened into a room they hadn't expected and weren't sure they wanted. "It hasn't been," she said. "That's why we're talking." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that this was not talking. Talking involves 2 people contributing. What Vivienne did was announce things and then wait for you to adjust. I dried my hands on the towel and said I'd like to be included in whatever discussion was happening with the rest of the family. She said, "Of course," in the tone she used when she meant the opposite. "My husband. His name is Kieran, and I want to be clear about who he was before all of this, which was a kind person, a genuinely kind person, who also had a very specific blind spot when it came to his mother, was in the living room with his brother, Pascal, going through some of Loretta's books. Pascal was 2 years older and had lived in Calgary for the past decade, which meant he flew in for occasions and felt, I think, that the geographical distance exempted him from forming opinions about anything that required sustained attention. He was fine. He was just not present in any way that mattered. Vivienne had married into the family. Loretta had been her mother-in-law, not her mother and Loretta's son. Vivienne's husband, who had died of a heart attack 8 years ago, had been the one Loretta was actually close to. After his death, the relationship between Vivienne and Loretta had been, from what I understood, politely maintained and not much more. Vivienne attended Christmas. Loretta sent birthday cards. They were courteous to each other in the way that people are, when the person who connected them is no longer there to provide a reason. What I did not know then, but would learn later, was that Loretta had been paying attention to all of us for much longer than any of us realized. The family dinner that night was 14 people. Vivienne's sister had driven up from Mahone Bay with her husband and their adult son, who was loud in a way that suggested he had never been asked to be quiet. There were cousins from Truro. There was an aunt who kept referring to the house as the property, as in, what are we going to do with the property, as though it were a problem to be managed, and not a place where a woman had lived for 43 years, and hung her own curtains and grown tomatoes in the side garden and raised a family. I was 31 years old. I had been part of this family since I was 24. I had spent more weekends in that house than I could count, had learned to make Loretta's fish chowder from the actual recipe card in her actual handwriting, had driven her to her cardiology appointments in Halifax the last 2 years of her life, when her license was suspended, and she was too proud to take a taxi. None of that was on the table when Vivienne stood up after the main course, tapped the side of her wine glass, and said she wanted to go over the situation with the house. She used the word situation. That was when I knew. "It's a significant asset," she said. "Loretta would have wanted the family to benefit from it practically, not sentimentally." Kieran glanced at me. I kept my face still. "We've spoken to a realtor," Vivienne continued, informally, just to get a sense. "She thinks the spring market, properly staged, could bring in somewhere between 900 and $1 million too. Obviously, that would be—" "You've already spoken to a realtor," I said. The table went quiet in the particular way that tables go quiet when someone says a thing that wasn't supposed to be said. Vivienne looked at me. An informal conversation. I just said that. "Loretta hasn't been gone 5 months, I said. "Grief doesn't have a timeline, but finances do," she said, and I had the strange experience of watching everyone at the table either look at their plates or minutely nod, as though this were wisdom and not a way of ending a conversation by sounding clinical. She loved this house, I said. I wasn't sure why I kept going, probably because no one else was. She spent her whole life here. I think we should at least talk about whether anyone in the family wants to keep it before we call a realtor. That's what we're doing, Vivian said. We're talking about the sale price, I said. That's different. Pascal cleared his throat. The loud cousin refilled his wine. Kieran put his hand briefly on my arm, which I recognized as his signal for let it go, which I also recognized as the thing I was not going to do. I'd like to keep it, I said. Or at least have the option. I'd like to know what Loretta actually wanted. Vivienne set down her glass. Loretta didn't leave specific instructions about the house. She left a will, I said, which leaves the estate to be distributed among the family. Vivienne said, which is what we're determining. I didn't have a response to that, because I didn't know enough. That was the problem. I had feelings and Vivienne had information, and in those situations information wins. I excused myself from the table before dessert. I went upstairs to the room Kieran and I always stayed in, the one at the end of the hall with the window that faced the harbor, and I sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the water, which was dark and flat, and gave nothing back. Kieran came up about 40 minutes later. She's not trying to hurt you, he said. I know, I said, because I did know. That was almost the harder thing. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She just didn't think about me at all. I was a variable in a calculation she was running, not a person with a claim. She has a point about the practical side, he said. She always has a point about the practical side, I said. That's not the same as being right. He sat down beside me. He was quiet for a minute. Gran loved you, he said finally. I know she did, I said. I loved her too. We didn't talk about the house again that night. The drive back to Halifax the next morning was 2 hours, and Vivian's voice was still in my head for most of it. Loretta would have wanted the family to benefit practically, not sentimentally, and I kept turning it over, the way you turn over a stone you're not sure you want to look under. The presumption of it. The certainty. The way she had used Loretta's name to ventriloquize a decision Loretta had never made, but I also didn't know what Loretta had wanted. That was the truth I couldn't get past. I had assumed, maybe, that there would be some indication, a conversation, a letter. Something that acknowledged the 7 years of Sunday dinners and cardiology appointments and fish chowder. But grief, I was learning, doesn't come with a receipt. You don't get credit for the time you put in. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early February. I was at my desk at the architecture firm where I work, eating lunch and going through a set of drawings for a renovation project in Dartmouth, and my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize, Halifax area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. Is this Marin? Marin Okafor Sinclair? Yes, I said. My name is Louise Arsenal. I'm a solicitor in Halifax. I was Loretta Sinclair's estate lawyer. I set down my fork. I've been trying to reach you for a few days, she said. I had a different number on file. I understand there may have been some recent discussions within the family about the Lunenburg property. Yes, I said carefully. I wanted to speak with you directly, because there are elements of Mrs. Sinclair's estate that specifically concern you, and I want to make sure you're aware of them before any decisions are finalized. I felt something shift in my chest, not hope exactly. More like the moment before hope, when you realize hope might be an option. I can come in, I said, whenever works. Can you come in Thursday? She said. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I didn't tell Kieran about the call. I'm not entirely sure why. Part of it was that I didn't know what I was walking into, and I didn't want to create an expectation, his or mine, that might not hold. Part of it was something smaller and harder to name, a sense that this was something I needed to do on my own first, before it became a family thing, before it got absorbed into the same conversation where Vivian had already set the terms. Louise Arsenal's office was on Barrington Street, 4th floor, with a view of the harbor on a clear day and the fog on the day I came in. She was in her late 50s, I thought, with short gray hair and reading glasses that she kept pushing up with one finger, and she had the particular manner of someone who has spent a long career delivering information that changes things, and has learned to do it without drama. She offered me tea. I said yes. She poured it from a carafe on the credenza, sat across from me, and opened a folder. Mrs. Sinclair came to see me about 14 months before her death, she said. She had been thinking, she told me, for some time. She made several amendments to her estate's plan that I want to walk you through. I held my mug with both hands. The property in Lunenburg, she said. The house and the associated land, approximately 0.4 acres. Mrs. Sinclair placed it in an inter vivos trust 2 years ago. She glanced up at me. That means a living trust, created during her lifetime outside the standard will. The assets in that trust do not go through the estate distribution process. Okay, I said, because I needed to say something. She named you as the sole beneficiary of that trust, Louise said. The house is yours, Marin. It was put in trust for you specifically. The family cannot contest the distribution of the house, because it's not part of the estate. It was already transferred. I don't know how long I sat there without speaking. Long enough that Louise pushed a box of tissues across the desk, which I didn't need yet but appreciated. She didn't tell me, I said. She said she didn't want it to change how you cared for her, Louise said. She said, and I'm paraphrasing from my notes, that she wanted to be cared for because she was loved, not because she was valuable. That was when I cried. Quietly, while Louise sat across from me and didn't look away or make it strange. Loretta. Of course she would think of that. There was also a letter. Louise handed it to me in a sealed envelope with my name on the front in Loretta's handwriting. That slightly forward-leaning cursive she'd had, the kind you don't see much from people under 70. I put it in my bag. I couldn't read it there. Not yet. Is there anything you'd like to ask me? Louise said. The family, I said. Vivienne, do they know yet? I've been notifying relevant parties this week, she said. I wanted to speak with you first. How will they receive this? I asked. I knew it was a strange question to ask a lawyer, but I asked it anyway. Louise paused in a way that suggested she had an opinion and had decided to offer something more measured instead. An inter vivos trust is a legal instrument that predates the current discussions, she said. It was created and executed by Mrs. Sinclair when she was of sound mind, with independent legal counsel. There's no mechanism to challenge it on the basis of preference. So it's done, I said. It's done, she said. I walked out of that building onto Barrington Street and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the February cold, the kind of damp Halifax cold that gets through your coat before you've even zipped it. And I just stood there. I watched a woman walk past with a stroller. I watched a delivery driver double park and run inside somewhere. I thought about Loretta sitting in that kitchen in Lunenburg, deciding, writing something down, handing it to this lawyer on a Tuesday or Thursday, making a decision in private that she never once mentioned to me, never gave herself away. I thought about the third step on the porch that creaks. I called Kieran from my car. I told him I needed to talk to him before anything else happened, and I told him where I'd been. He was quiet for a long time. Gran left you the house, he said, finally. Not a question. More like he was trying the sentence out. She put it in trust 2 years ago, I said. It's not part of the estate. It's already done. Another silence. I didn't know, he said. Neither did I said. Not until today. My mother is going to. He started and then stopped. I know, I said. He came home before dinner. We sat at the kitchen table in our apartment in Halifax, the small one on Quinpool Road with the radiator that clanks. And I made tea because that was the thing to do, and we talked. Actually talked for a long time. About Loretta. About the house. About what Kieran called, honestly and without defensiveness, the way his mother had been treating me for 6 years. It was one of the better conversations we'd had in a while, which made me feel something complicated about the fact that it had taken this to get here. He called Vivienne that evening. I was not in the room, but I could hear in intervals the silence between his sentences that meant she was reacting. At one point I heard him say clearly, she didn't leave it to the family, Mum. She left it to Marin, that's what she decided. And then quiet again, and then, because she wanted to. That's enough reason. When he came back into the kitchen, he sat down and put his head in his hands for a moment, not in distress, more in the way of someone releasing something heavy they'd been carrying in an awkward position. She's upset, he said. I know, I said. She thinks. He stopped. She has a lot of thoughts about it. Are you okay? He asked. I thought about it. I think so, I said. I think I will be. The letter. I read it that night at the kitchen table after Kieran went to bed. I'm not going to share all of it because some things are private and Loretta would have understood that. But there's one part I've thought about nearly every day since. She wrote, I have watched you show up when it wasn't required, and stay when it wasn't easy. I have watched you love this family without asking it to love you back first. I think you know what a house like that needs. I think you'll know what to do with it. And then, below that in slightly smaller writing, as though it were an afterthought but clearly wasn't. The third step on the porch creaks. Don't fix it. The following Saturday, Vivienne called me directly. I hadn't spoken to her since the dinner in Lunenburg. She called in the morning, while I was drinking coffee, and I answered because I had decided I was not going to avoid things. She said she wanted me to understand that she wasn't angry with me personally. I said I appreciated that. She said she thought Loretta's decision reflected some information she hadn't had, or some dynamic she hadn't fully understood, and that she thought perhaps if she had been more present in the later years. Vivienne, I said, gently, I don't think there's a version of this where the outcome would have been different. She knew what she wanted. She made a plan. That's actually very Loretta. Silence. It is very Loretta, she said finally, and I could hear in it something small and reluctant that might have been the closest she could get to concession. We talked for about 10 more minutes. It was not warm, but it was civil, and it was real. which was more than we'd managed in 6 years. I'll take it. Pascal sent a text that said, "Congrats on the house," and a thumbs up emoji, which was exactly as much as I'd expected from him. And I found I didn't mind. The first weekend we drove down to Lunenburg after everything settled was in late March, when the snow was still on the hills, but the harbor had that early spring look, gray and awake. We brought cleaning supplies and groceries, and a bottle of the red wine Loretta used to buy from the Nova Scotia winery she'd been a member of for years. We opened it that first night, sitting at the kitchen table with the old ceramic mugs she kept on the second shelf, because she thought proper wine glasses were, in her words, an unnecessary complication. We ate pasta. We didn't talk about any of it, not Vivienne, not the trust, not any of it. We just sat there in the kitchen where I had learned to make fish chowder, in the house on the hill above the harbor, and at some point, Kieran reached across the table and put his hand over mine, and we just stayed like that for a while. I went to bed before him and lay there listening to the sounds of the house, the way old houses have sounds. The particular groan of the floor in the upstairs hall, the hum of the old boiler, the wind off the harbor coming through somewhere around the window frame that would need weather stripping come fall. Not problems, just the house talking. In the morning I walked out to the porch in my socks with my coffee, and I stepped on the third step, and it creaked in exactly the way it always had, a low specific sound like a held breath letting go. I didn't fix it. I stood there on the porch above the harbor in the early April cold, and the water was doing what water in Nova Scotia does in April, which is glitter a little, and refused to commit to spring. And I thought about Loretta sitting on this same porch, deciding things, keeping her own counsel, watching people show up and watching what they did when they thought no one was paying attention. She was always paying attention. I pressed my foot against the step once more, just to hear it. Then I went inside, refilled my coffee, and started making a list of what the side garden would need before May.